Welcome to Sci-Philipod. I am your host, who has apparently completely taken over the podcast, Benjamin Weingard, assistant professor at Hillsdale College, with the co-host in lieu of a special guest, which would be preferable. We have...
I agree with that. The ever unemployed Bo Weingard, one-time assistant professor at a small college in an undisclosed location in the Midwest.
Yeah, again, no actual historical record of this employment ever happening. So today we're going to talk about the phenomenon known as wokeism. So we'll start with not quite an operational definition of it, but kind of a little bit of a kind of a description of the phenomenon, and then we'll ask why wokeism and discuss a little bit about the history of wokeism, and then conclude with our assessment of some of the consequences of wokeism, good and bad, and perhaps the future of wokeism.
Yes.
So let's start. In your view, what would you say is kind of the essence of wokeism?
I would call it a almost quasi-religious ideology that is oriented toward equality among individuals, but especially among demographic groups.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also especially focused on what is perceived as victims groups, so African Americans, Muslims, homosexuals, transgendered individuals, etc., groups that are perceived to have been oppressed or exploited by especially Western societies. So it's some sort of like quasi-religious ideology that promotes and protects those groups against what it sees as the ravages of the powerful, which in this case would be the mostly white male elite, I suppose. And this ideology then leads to, I think, behaviors that are an important and a defining feature of wokeism, right? Because you could have these attitudes, and I think like we wouldn't call it woke necessarily. The important part is that it leads to behaviors such as suppressing certain kinds of inquiry or free speech, interfering with due process, or making assumptions about, well, if a woman says that some male did this to her, then we're supposed to believe the woman. That's like the default position. Looking for incidences of racism in almost everything. So one thing that I did, I think it was a couple of days ago, I was just bored. So I was like, I'm going to type in just some nonsensical search and put "is racist" on the end of it, mm-hmm. and just see what I get. So I did like, baby food is racist, dance is racist, baseball is racist. And it's amazing what comes up these days. So I learned, for example, that square dance was a tool of white supremacy.
Like in the Jim Crow South or something?
Well, so apparently, there were people who wanted to make square dance like this important part of culture because it was this kind of white dance, right? I mean, I didn't read the article sedulously, so I don't want to say exactly what the argument was, but it's pretty preposterous. But I think that was in a Quartz online, so it wasn't just like some obscure blogger in the corner of the internet making this claim. Oh, dog ownership is racist. Star Wars is racist, of course. So anyway, so that seems to be an important part of what we describe now as wokeism. This insistence on searching for incidences of sexism, racism, transphobia everywhere.
Yeah, so so we have this kind of faith-based quasi-religious ideology that is especially concerned with the plight of historically marginalized groups of people, right?
Yeah, and
And
people get worked up about the religious part of this, right? So, for what, 5 to 10 years now, there has been debate about whether wokeism is a religion or is like a religion. I'm not sure that the debate's particularly illuminating in some respects. I mean, it just depends on how you define religion. But I would note that it shares a lot of features with religion.
so
Right?
there's a distinction in that wokeism, at least as currently instantiated in culture, doesn't really have anything to do with supernatural entities.
Right, but you could argue, yeah. So if you look in the literature on religious cognition, right,
Yeah,
one of the things that most researchers agree on is that religious cognition has to be related to supernatural entities somehow. Otherwise, it's not religious
right.
cognition. It might be ideological cognition or whatever. It is, however, the case that there are superstitious, somewhat supernatural elements in the woke ideology, right?
Yeah, and there are ritualistic elements that are
Right.
very similar to standard
Yeah.
religions.
So, for example, and we just had this case in which this girl used the N-word when she was 15,
Mhm.
and it was a non-pejorative use of the term, and I think she put it on Snapchat or some video format. Anyway, it's like a 3-second video. Somebody found it, kept it, released it 3 to 4 years later, and she had Tennessee, which she was accepted at Tennessee University. They pressured her into uh, going to a different university. Basically, they said, if you don't if you don't voluntarily leave, we're going to revoke your admission. So
Mhm.
that's a word.
Right.
There's something like a superstitious taboo there, that if you say a word, even if you're not deploying it to denigrate people, it's somehow a violation of this important principle, and you should be punished for it. And I know people, by the way, I actually have often asked people who consider themselves, quite liberal to progressive, but they're more the traditional, like, free speech liberal types. Is it wrong to use this word privately? If you just said it in a room by yourself, would that be wrong? And they'll say yes.
Right.
And
Right.
then why? Nobody can hear you. It doesn't actually do anything in the world, but there's just this sort of superstitious residue stuck to it.
Right. So it's become taboo in the way that fuck was taboo in the 1940s or
Right.
something.
But I think more taboo,
Yeah.
much more taboo.
Yeah,
It's
that's
taboo
right.
in the way that, like, some kind of desecration of a religious ornament would be. Like,
Mhm.
if you urinated on a Bible or burned a cross or something 200 years ago, it's like that level of taboo.
Right. So then, regardless of whether we conclude that it is like quote unquote religious or not, one thing that you can say about wokeism is it has a set of sacred values
Right.
that are extremely important to the woke, such as all groups are equal on all socially valued traits.
Right. And this one, all demographic groups are equal on socially valued traits. I think importantly, though, the woke would be more tolerant of inequality so long as it favored perceived victims groups.
Right.
So,
I
for
think that's
example,
correct.
if you came out with research that said that Black people had higher IQs on average than white people, that would be much more tolerated, perhaps even celebrated by the
Yeah, it might be lauded. So it might be that this sacred value as articulated is actually somewhat dissonant from the actual day-to-day view of hyper woke people, which is just anything that makes victims groups look better as good.
Right. And yes, because importantly also, if you proffer a cultural explanation for a disparity, so let's say you say, I think that the reason that white Americans earn more than Black Americans is because they have a culture that promotes entrepreneurship and academic success, and Blacks don't have that kind of a culture. That is seen as racist and chauvinist among a lot of people we would consider woke, because it seems to quote unquote blame the victim.
Right.
So the only explanation you can forward for these disparities now is an explanation that suggests that it's white's fault somehow.
Right. So you get this combination. So you have this kind of belief system with these sacred values, and then you have these behaviors that stem from it, namely suppressing certain forms of speech, attempting to cancel people, controlling and limiting discourse, especially in academia and the media.
Right.
What other kind of hallmarks of wokeism do you have? I think one that you had mentioned, but I think it's important, is that once you get these kind of sacred values and norms and mores in place, and then it leads to certain behaviors such as attempting to cancel people, then you have a dedicated class of like quasi intellectuals who actually just, rather than engaging in actually like productive intellectual activity, they spend their time attempting to find examples of, you know, like the evil of white men or something, right? They attempt to find examples of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. Right?
You have an entire intellectual discipline, actually multiple intellectual disciplines, whose raison d'etre, hate that term, shouldn't use it ever, but
I think it's just raison d'etre, but
yeah, raison d'etre is, that is reason for being, is basically to blame all disparities on white racism.
mm-hmm.
And then, yes, to find all of these outrageous examples of racism or sexism or transphobia or homophobia, etc. So yeah, I mean, if you try to read, for example, a Cornell West book or any so-called critical race scholar's work, it's hard to understand what they're saying exactly, because they sort of imported this postmodern argot that is very obscure and purposefully obscure. But if you just read it to say there are power relations in society based on race, and it's such that we live in a white supremacist society and therefore these other groups suffer, then that's a pretty good translation usually, right?
Yeah. And I think that's important, because once you have, you know, humans are pattern seeking animals. And once you have, you know, thousands of people who are just dedicated to finding examples of, you know, racism or sexism, you're going to start finding that everywhere. So you could have somebody like unironically talking about how, like, you know, like say playground swings are sexist.
Right. And you
why? Because they're
because of their height,
right? Because
they're tall. Yeah. The swings are too tall from the ground for young girls. They're designed for young boys, and therefore they're sexist against young girls.
Yes. And what's important is, although that sounds completely ridiculous and it's doubtful that many people would take it seriously, at least currently, a lot of things like these kind of woke findings that were kind of assumed to be ridiculous in the early 90s are now status quo. right?
Yes, and we'll get to that in a moment.
Yes.
So yeah,
But it's just a note that a
yes.
lot of times these things that seem innocuous or ridiculous may not be so, depending on how the kind of how far wokeism spreads through the culture.
Yeah, I think you can almost you can almost think of them the way you would think of like our attitude perhaps toward like chicken pox, because we're like, well, we have vaccines now, the immune system can handle it, who cares, except for our immune system is completely corrupted at this point. So these things that seem ridiculous and just easy targets to get eliminated by the culture actually don't get eliminated anymore. In fact,
Right.
they get spread widely. So yeah, I mean, you can't, people will say, and you see this on Twitter and you see this in debates quite a bit, what is this wokeism of which you speak, right? And it's like, yeah, it's understandable that some people might get disgruntled by the fact that you use this term that seems somewhat nebulous but bad to dismiss something or to denigrate it. But the fact of the matter is, any complicated social phenomenon, if you try to operationalize your definition of it, you're probably missing something. So I'm just going to accept in a Wittgensteinian manner that these are fuzzy concepts. There's nothing more we can do. We can't be 100% descriptive in our definition of it. But I think most people have a reasonable general idea of what woke means, or wokeism.
Right. And also importantly, I think wokeism is something of a repudiation of classical liberal or individualistic principles, right? Because
Yes.
we have all kinds of demographic groups. There are going to be disparities in all kinds of socially valued outcomes for myriad reasons, right? Whether that's because men and women have slightly different preferences for what they want to spend their time doing, whether that's because one group has an average higher IQ than another group, whatever the cause is, there are going to be disparities in outcome. And the kind of classical liberal or individualist approach is, provided that these disparities in outcomes do not result from procedural unfairness, that's okay. We accept that, and we're not going to focus on the larger groupings. What we're going to focus on is each individual maximizing his or her potential, and are there kind of artificial or socially imposed impediments in front of that person that was blocking them from achieving what they wanted to.
Yeah, I think caring about the underlying process more than the outcome, whereas wokeism, because it values equality or even reverse hierarchy so much, if necessary, it repudiates the procedural fairness, right? It rejects procedural fairness in favor of equity, right? So not equality, but equity. Now, this is something, I guess we can talk about this in a bit, but there's this kind of worrisome trend among even moderate Democrats or liberals to they've started using this term equity, which I think is kind of a subtle way to sneak in this concept of equality of outcome without explicitly asserting it, because it's probably still unpopular among most people. But I guess we can get to that. So yes, it's when you have a sacred value that is equality of outcome, other values are, if they don't promote that end, then you reject them. And so you can see this in, for example, New York Times articles arguing that we should get rid of blind tryouts for symphonies because they don't lead to enough diversity. Affirmative action, of course, is an explicit rejection of procedural fairness, and it's a handing out of massive advantages to people who are African of ancestry or Hispanic, so they have Hispanic ancestry. And there are myriad other examples, of course.
So the important point is that because you have this sacred value that all demographic groups are equal on all socially valued traits, and perhaps even these historically marginalized groups are superior, that's
Right.
okay.
Yeah.
That means like ipso facto, then outcomes should be similar across all of these groups, because it goes without saying that they possess equal levels of each of these traits, right? So
Right. So
the only explanation for disparities in outcome, this isn't evidence-based, it's a faith-based assertion, is
yes.
some form of discrimination or racism. And a lot of people who are really woke, and this is, I think, most closely associated with Ibram Kendi or Kendiism, this idea that even people who try hard not to be racist or sexist or homophobic, if they're not actively working against that, they are racist. Like there's no such thing as not being racist. Either you're racist or you're anti-racist.
Right. And so just on that point, before going backward for a second, there was that list of microaggressions, and one of the microaggressions, so a microaggression is not like an outright insult, but it's just a small thing that supposedly injures the psyche of the people who are exposed to it, because they're exposed to it over and over and over. So it's like, you get a paper cut, not a big deal. You get a million paper cuts, then it's an insult to the integrity of your body.
Examples of micro aggressions would include asking one of your Asian classmates if he
Right.
could help you with your math
Your
homework,
math, yeah.
because you assume because he's Asian that he's
Right.
particularly gifted with mathematics.
Or I suppose like asking a man to throw something when you want it to hit a target rather than a woman, because you assume the man can throw better. I guess that would be a microaggression.
I
So
doubt many people would care about that as a
that probably not,
microaggression.
but one of the microaggressions that was in this famous list was I'm colorblind, or society should be colorblind. So here the actual is an actual direct repudiation of the vision of classical liberalism, right? And exactly what you said, which is that this idea that according to these theorists, color blindness is actually an ideology that masks underlying racism.
Mhm.
And therefore, in fact, in some ways, it's sort of more insidious and pernicious, because it's a pleasant veneer on this ugly underworld. And theorists such as Kendi argue, yeah, a disparity is basically ipso facto evidence of racism or sexism, but obviously Kendi focuses more on racism.
And also, did you call him a theorist? I think that's being
Yeah,
generous.
I'm being charitable here. But yes, the idea is that a disparity is ipso facto evidence of underlying racism, although it's worth noting that these people use that principle rather selectively. So for
Yes.
example, I've never seen one of them say the NBA is racist because it's disproportionately black, nor have I seen any of them say America is an Asian supremacist country, even though Asians actually earn on average the most money per capita.
Right. Although you do have woke theories about the whites promoting Asians as a model minority to bludgeon African Americans and Hispanics.
Yeah, that's correct. So I guess the theory, it's not that it's an Asian supremacist country. It's actually that whites are in their just absolutely twisted and diabolical scheme to bludgeon the black person. They allow Asians to thrive and then say, why can't you do that?
Yes. Yeah. And it's also, it's worth noting that because in certain circumstances, the disparities in outcome, there's a very parsimonious explanation that has a lot of evidence for the disparity. And therefore, often those who are woke rely on extremely flimsy evidence, such as its stereotype threat or implicit bias.
Yes.
When
they look eagerly for any alternative explanation, right? And
right,
yeah,
exactly. So I think, as we'll see, then when progressives and people who are woke use science as their authority, it's a very selective view of science, right?
Hashtag trust science.
Right. Trust the experts when they agree with the progressive woke worldview.
Right. And yes, I think that is true. And we can, I think that's one of the consequences of wokeism and the woke takeover, especially of the social sciences, that we need to discuss. Yeah.
So then we have a question of, well, why wokeism?
Right.
What,
So
psychologically, sociologically, what's going on here? Why would this ideology spread when, I think if you looked at attitude surveys like Pew and Gallup, the modal person in the United States would explicitly endorse some form of procedural fairness and classical liberalism, right?
well, I think it's tricky because they would probably endorse both the procedural fairness and the classical liberalism and some woke remedies, because they are convinced that society is white supremacist, or
Yes.
there's a widespread prevailing view that society is pretty racist, right?
Yes, that is true, but it is safe to say that the wokeism didn't emerge in the like average middle class family, right?
Right.
It's an avant-garde intellectual movement
Yeah.
that has spread
Yes.
from intellectual elites through the population rather
Yeah.
than being grassroots.
So we would talk about what has been dubbed, including by us, in one of our articles, as the Great Awokening, right? Comparing it to the Great Awakening, of course, which was this religious revival in the United States. I want to say in the 17, was Edwards in the 40s and 50s or something?
Yeah, somewhere around
right
there.
around there. Anyway, so yeah, so what led to this, right?
Yeah.
Why?
How can we make sense of it?
How make sense of it? So first point is, yes, it's largely an elite driven phenomenon, or it was at least an elite driven phenomenon, educated
Yes.
elites. And I think we could say that you see the beginnings of it, right, in the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
That's when you see the sort of first stirrings of it, and you get Montague and others really arguing against what they considered racist theories. You get these first arguments that, in fact, race is like, it doesn't exist. Race is very malleable. Society is pervasively sexist and racist, etc. And obviously, with the youth counterculture movement in the 60s, that goes a little mainstream, right? To the point that, at least mainstream on college campuses, say, to the point that people such as Isaac and Arthur Jensen were getting death threats for forwarding theories that went against woke sacred values. Right. So it's a youth-led, elite, educated-led phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we would argue that I think it's probably like at least two things going on, probably more, but let's focus on the two first. So one is, it's an elite signaling phenomenon. And now how could it be signaling to say you're an ally to African Americans or something? Well, it's signaling in that it displays one's education, one's ability to speak this impenetrable language often, right? And it's in a language that keeps updating, which is an interesting point. So it's like a fashion. Mm-hmm. So we went from, I don't want to say the word, so I'll just say we went from one N word, which was perfectly acceptable, and I don't mean the worst one, but I mean the other one. I hope people can figure out what that is, because I don't want to get myself in trouble. So we went from that to African American to Black, and we had these controversies about what can you say and then person of color, but you can't say the reverse of that. That gets you in trouble.
Benedict Cumberbatch found
As
that out.
Cumberbatch found out and had to make his, his self-flagellating apology. Now we have this term BIPOC or BIPOC. I don't even know how it's actually pronounced. BIPOC, which is, I guess, what is it? Black Indigenous people of color. I mean, it's hard for me to keep up to date on this. And I'm an educated person who has a lot of free time to read this stuff.
Right.
So if you can command this language, it displays that you're in the know. So that's one way that it's signaling, right?
Right. So importantly, there are different theories about how people obtain status in groups. I think this is important, right? So through prestige, that is being able to offer benefits to the group that you're a member of. Through dominance, that is being able to injure people who try to oppose you. And one theory is possessing moral virtue actually helps you gain status in groups, right?
Yes.
And specifically signaling the possession of moral virtue. So this kind of signaling, then you're signaling to other educated elites that you possess the moral virtue of having extreme empathy for historically marginalized populations.
But also importantly, I don't know how much of this signal is about moral virtue. I mean, I agree that is one way to achieve status in a group is to signal the possession of certain moral traits.
Yes.
But I don't think much of the woke phenomenon is driven by that. I think it's signaling education and sort of status among a middle to upper class, right? Because it's what I mean, we didn't call it this in our article, Preachers of the Great Awokening, which I think is still one of the better articles we wrote, if I may say so. But Rob Henderson, right, calls it luxury beliefs. And I think that's a good term for it. I wish I had come up with it.
Well, I think you could almost substitute, instead of using the term like moral virtue theory of status, it's more possession and display of the cultural values and behavioral norms of your coalition, right? And in
Sure, but not even just that. It's also a display that you're a prestigious person who has these valued traits, right?
Right, but they're traits that are valued among the educated elite. So I'm going to possess, I'm going to signal that I possess this recondite form of empathy for this particular group, right?
Right. My empathy, and importantly, it's this kind of empathy that's not quote unquote parochial. So it's like, I don't care more about people in my community than others. I actually care completely abstractly about humanity. So I do effective altruism, or I care about these people from a different race who live thousands of miles away from me. Yeah.
Right.
So Rob calls it luxury beliefs though, and compares it to so you know the Torstein, is it Torstein or Thorstein, however you say his first name, Veblen, right? The conspicuous consumption, or the idea of like luxury consumption. Like, why would people display the fact that they don't have to work and that they have leisure time or whatever? Well, it's displaying that you're in a wealthy family. You have the time and the resources to burn on these luxury activities. Similarly, if you can learn Jacques Derrida or one of these postmodern theorists and have this what appears to be self-harming view of the world, namely this view that white people are peculiarly evil, right? And you can flagellate yourself publicly, that seems to signal the possession of these traits, luxury, wealth, whatever. And importantly, usually you're espousing beliefs that don't hurt you and your family, they hurt other white people.
Right.
Right. Affirmative action's not hurting the person with a 140 IQ. It's hurting the person who's more on the cusp, who's going to be outcompeted by a person of color who might have lower, objectively lower qualities to getting into a university or whatever.
But importantly, woke people would tend to justify their own status by reference to their moral enlightenment, right?
Right. So that was the argument we made of the preachers. So like, why do the why do the preachers get status? Why does Ezra Klein or whoever else, why
not just why do they get status, but how do they justify their status? Because
right,
in reality,
yes.
the reason Ezra Klein has a lot of status is because he's really intelligent and
Right.
he thinks very lucidly about politics outside of the realm of woke issues, right? He's actually somebody you want to pay attention to because you learn a lot about the world. Like his book on polarization is phenomenally well done.
Right.
So I think the old left, they would kind of justify their own status as we're piercing through like the kind of veil here, and we're giving you insights into the political world that are actionable, that you can actually use to make substantive changes to the world, right? Whereas the kind of modern like woke intellectuals are a little bit reticent to justify their own status through their intellectual prowess, and it's more by reference
I'm
to.
not sure that I mean, I get what you're saying. I'm not sure I completely agree with that. And that hasn't it always been the case, or maybe not, maybe always is a strong claim there, but from the 1880s, let's say, hasn't it been the case that intellectuals have attempted to justify and have been in a somewhat awkward position justifying their prestige because they've often ridiculed and harshly criticized people with power? So how do you justify, if you were a Marxist, right? If you were part of the vanguard, how did you justify your prestige? Well, you justified it by suggesting that you had particular moral insight into the world, and therefore people should defer to you, and you are going to lead this vanguard movement. Now, it is true that Marxism had this sort of love for science and experts, but so does wokeism. So does trust the science, right? As long as it's the right science, as we've said. So
I think that's accurate. There might be more of a subtle shift toward self-justification through your like moral enlightenment and moral rectitude than there was in the 30s and 40s.
Like, I think that's probably
right. You get somebody like, say John Maynard Keynes, the justification for your status is that you know more about economics and that's practical and useful. Right.
Yeah. To be fair though, Maynard Keynes is like this weird gentry person, this bohemian gentry who's also ends up moving toward what we would consider now a pretty progressive position in the 1940s in his later life, at least. But that's a completely different cultural environment,
right? Which that's also kind of the point, right? Is that if you're in this cultural milieu where wokeism is exceedingly important to gain status, then the way that intellectuals self-justify is going to change. Right. Because
I agree with that. You're right. So like
you don't feel as comfortable self-justifying on the basis of your superior intellect and knowledge of, say, like some technocratic component of economic analysis.
Right. And I mean, importantly, you can't specifically say, if you're Ezra Klein, you can't say I have status because I am smarter than other people, because you're often expressing skepticism about the utility of the concept of intelligence.
Correct.
That just seems like uncouth and boorish to the woke, right?
Right.
But I think it's important that they're also providing a justificatory narrative for other people.
Right.
I think that's why they get status in the same way that preachers got status, because they promoted this very moralistic vision of the world, but one that justified, why does the believer deserve more status than the non-believer or the morally fallen? So the woke preachers provide this narrative that allows people to justify, like, if you're a middle class educated white, why do you have the status you have? Why can you feel good about yourself? Because you recognize your own moral depravity.
Yeah. So
And
that
at least you recognize that, and that makes you better than the sort of buffoonish whites who don't realize it.
right. But if you're a hyper woke intellectual, such as, let's say, Ezra Klein, for example, you are in this unenviable position of, you have a lot more status and you earn more income than a lot
Yes.
of the historically marginalized
Yes.
groups that
Right.
you claim to care so much about. And no doubt
Correct.
Klein actually does. I'm not
Right.
accusing him of bad faith, but there's something dissonant about that psychologically. And you're like, wait, why do I earn $250,000 a year and have all this status, whereas this hardworking African-American woman who has 3 jobs, like at McDonald's and Walmart and some other gas station on the weekend, she
Right.
doesn't earn that much. She earns like 35,000 a year.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I think that a lot of upper middle class educated whites are in that same position, and the reason they give status to Ezra Klein is precisely because he provides them the narrative that allows them to justify their own status.
I agree with that.
Right.
So there are 2 issues there. There's why do other hyper educated people give Klein status, and then there's the how would Klein self-justify, and how do other intellectuals justify themselves personally?
Agreed. So this is the first part here, is this signaling phenomenon. So in this sense, the easiest, most concrete comparison is to fashion, right? Elites have used fashion to separate themselves from hoi polloi for thousands of years, quite literally, and they've had sumptuary laws.
Not going to use a definite article.
Not going to do it because hoi polloi literally means the people. So I'm not going to say the people. I'm signaling my prestige.
I see.
So sumptuary laws actually forbade people, certain groups, from wearing certain items because only elites could wear them. Right. So this using fashion to signal status is very old. It has a long history, and wokeism is just sort of the newest iteration of this.
And then just as we noted, but I'll just throw this in again. So now there is this tension that's difficult to get rid of between wokeism, which is like this egalitarian ideology, and the fact that you're explicitly signaling to gain status, right? There's kind of a pull between there.
Right, because Roman elites, like Julius Caesar, would just say, yeah, I'm fucking better than other people.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
there was no tension there. There was just an expectation.
I trace my lineage to Annius, right? I'm superior.
Right, I get to wear purple because I'm better than other people are, and that's just fine. And now, you're right. You can't say I'm better than other people, because that's the strikes at the very heart of the woke narrative.
Right.
Yeah. So that's one thing. Another thing I think is just an actual increase in ability to follow one's abstract sense of fairness. Mm-hmm. So as you get more affluence and you become more affluent and more divorced from the hardships of day-to-day life,
more existentially secure as a society.
Yes, much more secure. We do have it doesn't matter if one accepts sort of the Haidt moral foundations framework or Kurt Gray's framework or some other framework. It's pretty clear that we have intuitive moral systems, and we have intuitive senses of fairness, etc. And so we have this sense of fairness and this desire somewhat conflicting, but a desire for equality or a disgust with inequality seems to be somewhat natural in humans. I mean,
especially a desire, a kind of folk desire for fairness.
yes, but Christopher Bohm, I believe his name is, argues like humans are unique among primates in that we almost have a reverse status hierarchy, right? We get
Right.
angry when people arrogate too much power to themselves and we attempt to topple them.
Right.
So as we get more educated, more divorced from day-to-day hardships of working, etc., we can play out these abstract moral concerns more. We can
Yes.
become more obsessed with them. And I think that's another explanation for this.
And I think there's very solid evidence for that, most notably in the research of Ronald Inglehart, Christopher Welzel, Pippa Norris, these world value surveys where they look at the extent to which people endorse what are known as self-expression values, which would be considered, I guess, like, I don't want to say they're woke values, but they're value. It means that you put a premium on tolerance, not being conformist or rigidly hierarchical.
Would you say like also symbolic identity is much more important than sort of concrete identity relationships?
Yeah, this shift from materialistic values, that is just like the resources that you accrue over your lifetime, to post-material values, quality of life, how autonomous you are. Are you a moral person? Are you engaging in intrinsically rewarding creative activities? And what you see is that the average person in affluent societies endorses these self-expression values much more in 2020 than they did even in 1980. There's been this steady increase that's associated with, as we said, existential security, affluence, education.
Right. So like you can think about the increase in piercings and tattoos. It's just like one manifestation of this. People care more about expressing their unique identity. It's not like the tribal identity or the nation identity. It's my own identity. I have these tattoos and they say something about me, and that's really important to me. That doesn't necessarily have to lead to wokeism, but I think it allows the freedom and the psychological it creates the sort of psychological obsessions that can veer into wokeism, right?
Yes.
So that's one. And importantly here, even if the signaling part of it is, say, 70% of the story, that doesn't mean that all of the people who are engaged in the signaling are behaving cynically.
Right.
Because they may be convinced that is what they care about.
Right. Because we have to add, like, so you have these shifting values based on shifting objective economic conditions. You have this signaling system, but you also have the fact that there were very real injustices in society.
Right.
All, through the 1950s and the 1960s, and younger people, especially educated people, were quite rightly disgusted by that and pushed hard to create a more just, egalitarian society. Right.
Yes.
So
yes,
I think
that's fair. Although I would argue that a lot of the sort of traditional narrative of slavery, Jim Crow, end of Jim Crow civil rights is probably tilted in too progressive a direction. And maybe there are things to challenge there. It's definitely the case that there were injustices that were also real.
Right. And it's also the case that you had, somewhat obsolete, rigid gender norms that people were rebelling against in the 60s and 70s. Right.
Man, I'm not 100% sure about that. but yeah, you could argue that at least.
Well, let's say this
legitimate case.
Especially so if you're an individual who's born and you're like, you really adhere to these self-expression values, and autonomy is extremely important, and you dislike coercion and authority. You're going to view these gender role norms as ipso facto illegitimate, even if they are useful, and from a conservative perspective, maybe we shouldn't jettison them completely.
Yeah, I agree, because if self-expression, when that becomes your most important value, you see anything that is coercive as illegitimate.
Right.
And so a gender norm that attempts to guide men into one career track and women into another, even if some of those women would prefer to do something else, seems intolerable. And yes, it's completely understandable from a descriptive point of view why people would rebel against that in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. Yeah.
And I think it's also important, like economically and sociologically, when thinking about the rise of wokeism, that post the Civil Rights Act, you actually created a diversity bureaucracy in hundreds of institutions that provided employment to people who were educated and woke. And they're kind of, I won't say the term, their reason for being, I'll use the English variant. Their reason for being was breaking down these injustices against historically marginalized people. And therefore, when you have this greater supply of opportunities for people who are woke, they're going to take advantage of that, right? And there's going to be more of a demand, or I'm sorry, when you have more of a demand, there's going to be more of a supply to meet that.
Well, right. And this is one of the things that Christopher Caldwell goes over so well in The Age of Entitlement, his history since basically, like since the 60s.
It's somewhat tendentious, perhaps, at least contentious history. But
I put it this way. It's a useful corrective and a sort of attack on the traditional story from the 60s.
That's right.
People do not understand the extent of this bureaucracy that grew up in the 60s around the issue of diversity, which is really not diversity. What it is it's helping people of color and educated white people.
Yes.
And we're talking about billions upon billions of dollars a year. So in 2003, they estimated that businesses had spent $8 billion a year on diversity training and other programs. Now, a lot of that money is just going to educated elite bureaucrats, white bureaucrats. Some of it is going to people of color and other people. But
it's going to a lot of white people who are coming out of social work programs, for example, and they don't really have good prospects for employment outside of this diversity bureaucracy.
And this is, I mean, when you think about, businesses spending 8 million, universities are spending who knows how much, right?
It would be hard to even track how.
I looked this up. Somebody had, I think it was somebody from Wisconsin, from the University of Wisconsin, had estimated the sort of price of these diversity bureaucracies and universities. And it was, I can't remember, I don't even want to hazard a guess. I will say it was mind blowing how much it was. I mean, it is truly remarkable. But if you think about it, at every university that's, somewhat serious, maybe aside from ones that are explicitly conservative or classically liberal in orientation, there is a large diversity bureaucracy, and they spend lots of money on that bureaucracy.
Yes, they do.
So we have that, and so importantly, as these younger, more educated people with these kind of woke self-expression values start to take over institutions, they change the incentive structure. Right? Because now the way you achieve status in an institution is you express woke values too.
Right. And importantly, it's like an arms race. You express that you have even more of these woke values than the older, racists who currently inhabit the institution.
Right. And I think that, I mean, getting into why is this, I mean, I think we both noticed this, and many people did, that after the death of George Floyd, this process just absolutely rocketed up, right? I mean, it was a dramatic change before and after, but this trend had been obviously it existed well before the death of George Floyd. And one thing that happens is you get a critical mass of woke elites in institutional positions to reward other people. And when you get to that point, actually, importantly, to reward and punish other people.
Right. That I was going to say, that's important, that you have a critical mass in terms of concrete power over these institutions, such that you can punish people who go against your kind of narrative, and you can reward people who adhere to it and promote it.
Right. And then you get to the point, you start to create a homogeneity, right? Because people who threaten your sacred values are rejected. People who voice strong support for your sacred values, of course, are rewarded. And this is how any ideology works. I mean, it's not surprising that this is what happens. I think our concern and our problem is that we think wokeism is largely not nefarious, but a pernicious ideology. But yeah, this is how any ideology works. And so once you get that, and I think you go through the night, because you look at, like, Christina Hoff Sommers wrote the book Who Stole Feminism. I think that was like 93 or 94 even. And she was going over this phenomenon of just how, like, the feminists had taken, they sort of saw the long game. They got institutional control, especially at universities. And when that started happening, then they could exert real power that wasn't just ideological. So, right, you have ideological power, are my ideas persuasive to other people? But then you get institutional power. Can I fire people? Can I put my curriculum into the college, etc.? Can I give promotions to people? That's really important. And that's the stage we're in, is like what you would call woke institutional control,
right? And
universities and the media now.
Right. So that's another important thing, is that these concerns about wokeism, I think this is less so the case now because people can see that it's not limited to campuses, but often critics of anti-woke people would say this is just an issue on college campuses. Like, right, it's kind of ridiculous to get that concerned about it. It doesn't really affect your day-to-day life. Just, whatever. Kids are stupid, and that's how colleges have always been. But importantly, the college and university was just the leading edge of wokeism. As wokeism spreads throughout educational institutions, these are the individuals who are going to run society in the future. So they move into the diversity bureaucracy, they move into prestige media, they move into Hollywood. And now a lot of these individuals are moving into the corporate world, especially big tech. I think the reason big tech is important is because they're completely reliant on a hyper educated workforce in a way that General Motors is not, right?
Yeah. So it turns out, right, that what happened on the campus did not stay on the campus.
That's right.
In fact, university behavior through, say, the 60s to the 90s was actually an ominous augury of what was to come in the corporate world.
Right.
And the corporate media world, importantly. So, for example, and this is really important because of the way it rewards and punishes people. So I think a good example is Ed Yong at The Atlantic, who's their science writer. Now, he's a talented writer, obviously, and like a very smart person, but he's hyper woke. And you ask, well, why is Yong hyper woke? Well, he's probably a true believer, one thing. But another thing is, if you're an ambitious, talented science writer, you have to be woke if you want to write at the New York Times, The Atlantic, or another one of these papers.
Right.
So it just makes sense that you're going to adopt those values,
Mhm.
even if you're not a strong believer in them. And probably you come to believe them, because one of my sort of principles and psychological principles is people generally come to believe what's useful for them. So,
Right.
so you see that's like these people come out of the campus, they start to get into these other institutions and they start to exert control there. And when you
Right.
do that, then you eliminate, like you can't even imagine a non-woke or an anti-woke science writer making it at I mean, like Nicholas Wade made it at the New York Times before getting canceled.
Right.
But
Yes.
like that's probably the last you're going to see. So you have to get these people who make all of these gratuitous swipes at Trump and conservatives in their writings on science, and of course about like everything's racist. I mean, Young, for fuck's sake, applauded Saini's book on race, which is an absolute, unqualified, unmitigated disaster of a book.
Mhm.
That's how woke he is.
Yeah, and this is where it does really turn into the equivalent of like an orthodox, like religious
Right. So
ideology. Because if
before you say this, so you can say we're now in the stage of sort of like orthodoxy, right?
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So if I'm let's say I'm a classically liberal, really talented writer, and I'm ambitious, I just graduate from journalism school. Even if I don't have the kind of orthodox woke worldview, I know to get hired at the New York Times or the Atlantic or these other prestige outlets, I have to at least give lip service to that system. And as
Right.
you said, like psychologically, probably what happens is at first I'm like, yeah, whatever. I'll throw some bromides in my articles. And
Right.
then after a few years, as I'm advancing, I actually just internalize that belief system because
Right.
it's advantageous to me. I'm getting rewarded for it, right?
Right. So
Uh,
so
yeah, and also I'd just say importantly, we mentioned these businesses like big tech going woke. Well, that's really important because if you look at the largest corporations, the most powerful corporations in the world in 2020, right? It's Google,
mhm,
Facebook,
mhm,
Amazon,
mhm.
Apple. Like these are the companies that exert disproportionate influence on society now, right?
Right.
So it's not like it's just some like local boutique shop where the owners went woke. This is
Right.
like it's extremely powerful institutions, and obviously the media are extremely powerful.
Right. I think that was what I was gonna add is, the New York Times has a lot of power,
And in
obviously.
fact, with the decline of local newspapers, the power of the Washington Post and the New York Times has grown over the last decade.
Right, right. And so the orthodox stage, which is definitely the stage we're in, is the stage in which the campus, as Andrew Sullivan wrote, we all live on a campus now. Like the campus, it's not that all communities are woke, or if you're where I am in West Virginia, it's not that woke. It's that the mainstream institutions are woke. They are captured by the woke. And
Right.
there is this prevailing orthodoxy that's so powerful that the NBA, right,
Mhm.
the Amazon, major banks, they were all expressing solidarity with Black Lives Matter.
Yeah,
Now,
literally Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan Chase,
yes,
had a picture of him. I don't know if it was he put it on Instagram, but it was out there, and he clearly wanted people to see it of him taking the knee, right?
well,
Jamie Dimon, your arc
yes,
capitalist,
right.
like CEO of a financial corporation, is like, I am down with wokeism.
I mean, what was didn't Bezos release like exchanges he had with some people where he was like,
With a
I'm
customer.
happy to fucking lose your
Yeah,
business.
so he literally like had a customer who made, I think they sent an Amazon email or maybe a direct email to Jeff at Amazon.com. it said something. The comment was racist. It was not a good email to send, obviously, but it is telling that instead of just ignoring it as Bezos does the other thousands of emails that he gets bitching and complaining per day,
Right.
he took to Instagram to signal his response, which was, "You're the type of customer I'm happy to lose." So you're, again, you have this arc capitalist whose entire life is, I want to get every fucking customer I can. Anybody, please order from me. But in this case, to signal woke solidarity, it's like, I don't want this person as a customer.
Right. And it's important to note here that Black Lives Matter is definitely a woke movement.
Yes.
Because look, there's this ambiguity that I think people play on, which is, well, of course, Black Lives Matter. Well, yeah, no shit. Nobody who's serious in the United States disagrees with that.
Right.
We know, however, that there's the more woke meaning of Black Lives Matter, which is this belief that the United States is systemically racist, especially the police are systemically racist.
Yes.
And that leads to this horrendous, disproportionate killing of Black men, especially, etc. So when these companies are advertising that, like when you went to Amazon, it said Black Lives Matter. When you went to Audible, Black Lives Matter, and then it would recommend these idiotic books that were basically all, America's racist. So you
Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi.
And then the case, that book I remember was
Isabella Wilkinson.
Right. So this is definitely, this is like when you're hitting, we're at, we hope, might be peak woke, although I doubt it. I think it can still become more woke. But we're at woke orthodoxy, in which people are terminated for having the wrong views, namely views that challenge wokeism. I know about that. Noah Carl knows about that. James Damore knows about that.
Also, we'll note that you get what you're doing right now, which is you get the grievance collecting backlash to gain status, right?
Yes, that's right. So you get this, there's this sort of, what would you say, like this, but this is what happens among minority groups who are persecuted, right? They actually start to revel in their persecution and use that as a sign of their status. So for example, under quote unquote Bloody Mary, right, who was the Queen of England, who was a Catholic after the Protestant Reformation, after Henry VIII's Reformation, all of these people, I mean, the reason we think of her as Bloody Mary, even though she didn't kill particularly many people relative to others around the time, is because there were people writing like martyrdom tracts about the heretics who were burned under her regime. And so that's how you got status. You became a martyr. And so now, you can get status becoming a martyr of the orthodoxy, right? You get terminated for truth, and then you become, and so there is this victim dialectic that it's, on the one hand, it's understandable. Like I always said, if they martyr me, I'll fucking play the martyr. It's understandable.
It is very understandable.
Yeah, but
I think that the Orthodox stage, it's important to think about if you were a detached, like anthropological observer, how bizarre you would find this, right? Because you go on Amazon, again, the quintessential capitalist company, and they're shoving this down your throat. You don't just go on their webpage and shop for books that are recommended to you through the normal algorithms that they use. It's, we support Black Lives Matter, donate here are all of these books that you'll probably love about BLM, even though nothing in my order history would support the idea that I'm not ordering like Ibram Kendi's latest tract. I'm not reading D'Angelo. So it's like, it's beyond simply advocating for equal rights or anything. This is shoving
well beyond that.
Right. This is these mainstream powerful institutions shoving this down your throat. And my the most annoying thing that happened to me just when I was quarantining, and I'm paying off my credit card, so I go on the JP Morgan Chase site. I'm paying them thousands of dollars to pay off my credit cards, but I can't escape that when I go on the webpage, the first thing that pops up is something about BLM and donate to them, right?
Right.
So again, I don't understand, like, why would that be on my credit card?
Right.
The webpage where I'm paying for that. It really is very imperialistic culturally.
Yeah, this is what people call now, because the phenomenon has been around for long enough. People have noticed it, criticized it, kind of been annoyed by it for long enough that they've termed it woke capitalism.
Yes,
Right.
that's
And this is, I think this is, it's a way, it's a very, it's serendipitous the way that all of these interests sort of align with the woke message from the corporate. If you're just thinking of it diabolically and scheming on behalf of a corporation, wokeism's awesome because it gives you this way to justify what you're doing to people who would otherwise be critical of you, right? Because educated people are often critical of businesses and corporations.
Yeah, critical often of just capitalism.
Of capitalism,
Yeah.
right. So this is a narrative, it's a way to appeal to their now that they're very concerned with opinion morality, what Michael Anton calls opinion morality, where what you say and express publicly is almost more important than what you do.
Right.
So businesses can defang their criticisms by appealing to their wokeness. Also, it undermines a working class coalition that's multiracial because it's so obsessed with the victim's narrative of POCs that it alienates white people who believe basically we live in a society that isn't racist. In fact, if it's racist now against whites because they're constantly depicted as the villain in all of these stories.
Right. So importantly, it alienates the white working class.
Right. It alienates the white working class. And so the white working class finds themselves more simpatico with the sort of populist conservative coalition, whereas the POC working class, by and large, finds themselves sympathetic with the Democratic coalition. So it fractures the working class, which is great for corporate leaders. Now, I'm not saying again, it's not that the corporate leaders are sitting there twisting their evil mustaches and consciously thinking this. It's just that all of these interests conspire to work together to make woke capitalism a very effective and popular phenomenon.
Certainly, just functionally from the point of view of Jeff Bezos, you would have a preference dealing with woke issues rather than addressing issues about the pay in Amazon warehouses, the lack of a union, working conditions, etc., or maybe more abstruse economic debates about if Amazon's a monopoly.
Right. And in fact, how powerful is wokeism? Wokeism's so powerful that it broke Bernie Sanders, right? And this is important to think about because Bernie Sanders is like the last sort of paragon of the old left that was class-based. Their analysis was there are classes in society, and those are the most important power relations to look at if you want to understand conflict in society. And what we need to do is fight for the lower and the working classes against the capitalists and the wealthy. So in 2016, even Bernie Sanders was reasonably not woke, right? Because he still thought in his heart of hearts, I think, that like immigration issues and race issues were a distraction from class issues. And in fact, he, in a very famous interview, he said, somebody was talking to him about open borders or something. And he said, basically, open borders are a Koch brothers funded conspiracy.
Right.
And so this is following in the tradition of people like Ralph Nader. Like I remember, I didn't realize at the time that this was such a great illustration of this conflict, but I went to a Ralph Nader presentation at Michigan State in like 2005.
I happened to be there.
Yeah, and there were a lot of protests against Nader from people who were open borders advocates. And Nader was adamant in rejecting their arguments because he's like, look, it will destroy American workers, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
this was a very common view among the old left. Now the new left, Bernie Sanders rebooted for 2020, is basically open borders functionally. Like, yeah, he's not really, but he's unwilling to forward a limiting principle because he realizes that would be unpopular among the zealous woke base on the
Right.
left.
And we should say it's not at all surprising that an orthodox ideology developed and promulgated by educated elites is particularly effective at helping educated elites gain status and resources in society. Not at all shocking.
As Adam Smith, to paraphrase Adam Smith, right? The educated make sure that their needs are peculiarly attended to, right?
Yes, that is correct. So it is really fascinating, though, how effective the ideology of wokeism is at maximizing the cultural and economic resources of educated elites. As we said, like the diversity bureaucracy is just basically like this, like supplies a bunch of middle class
it gives
jobs.
money to people with degrees.
Right. It's just, yeah. Do you want to live a comfortable middle class life? Here you go. Get woke and
get a degree, and then we'll pay you
Yes.
to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
So maybe we should think. I mean, we're already kind of talking about it, but we should talk about the sort of why is this ideology pernicious, right?
Yeah,
like,
so
what is it that's so problematic about it? Because you get people who say, like, yeah, what's wrong with equal rights and fighting for racial justice? Those are great things. So yeah, they, equal rights, that's good. We've had those since the 60s.
Yeah, treating people as much as possible based on their character rather than superficial traits. That's good.
That's good.
We've really pushed for that since at least the 1960s.
Right. And so what's pernicious about it is that it's illiberal. And it's illiberal because liberalism, the sacred values of liberalism are freedom of speech and inquiry, due process, rule of law, and procedural fairness.
I would also add property rights and
yes, of course,
limited government. And I don't mean not having a welfare state. I mean that the government's intrusion on your day-to-day life is kept to a functional minimum.
Right. What Benjamin Constant, when he wrote about like the difference between old, like liberty old and new, and like new liberty, one of the important things about it was having this private sphere that wasn't political.
Right.
People don't understand that's, like if you go back to Greek democracy, and that's an applauded achievement, but everybody was political and everything was political. There was no escaping it. Now we're supposed to have the freedom under liberalism to not be political.
Right. So
have sports and entertainment and private life that has nothing to do with politics.
Also, like, just, importantly, like, imagine how you would feel if when you went to the DMV, instead of just having this technocratic bureaucracy that treated everybody equally, they were explicitly promoting a particular religious worldview. Right.
That would be the equivalent of wokeism, I think.
Right. And
it's
that
basically,
Yeah, I mean, we had this example with Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, mandating implicit bias training for all state workers. That's an example of this quasi-religious ideology being inflicted upon people, right?
Inflicted is the right word.
It is, because importantly,
I was going to say foisted, but
inflicted upon.
Yes,
because importantly, these implicit bias training, the evidence suggests that they're not effective, right? So it's just
but not only that, but another important thing about it is that all of these training things and the diversity stuff, the basic message is white people are bad. I mean, it really is. I've sat through these things. I know you have, and the message is white people are implacably racist. Society is implacably racist. And until we accept that and just like admit that to ourselves and flagellate ourselves in our culture, we are evil sinners who don't
Yes.
deserve redemption, right?
So let's flesh out then the sacred values of classical liberalism and then
Right.
how
So
wokeism subverts those.
right. So I think those are, I think you're right that the private sphere is an important part of it. So we have like due process, freedom of speech and inquiry. Of course, freedom of speech and inquiry were always limited in certain ways. We know that that's nuanced, but that was an important part of this Anglo heritage of classical liberalism.
Right. So importantly,
Procedural fairness too.
yeah,
Right?
yeah. So, very importantly, in the classical liberal worldview, then, provided that you have procedural fairness, you will tolerate even steep disparities in outcomes.
Right.
Right. And that's important because you just allow that to occur. That, you know, it's maybe you do something relatively benign to deal with the disparity,
Mm-hmm.
right? But you accept that that is a an outcome of procedural fairness that can happen.
Now, I think this is an interesting thing, and somebody, people have written books about it, but if you think about inequality of outcome carefully, is an important thing that we should do more, because in many ways, that's like a challenge that any complicated, wealthy society has to deal with, because we evolved in the context of groups that were relatively egalitarian by necessity, because there
Right.
was simply no way to hoard resources. I mean, you didn't really have a lot of resources to hoard, but even if you had those resources, there was no way to hoard them.
Mhm.
So we're offended. I think we have sort of mental mechanisms that cause us to be offended by great amounts of resource inequality.
Mhm.
But it turns out that a society with procedural fairness, that's capitalist and that's affluent, will create great amounts of inequality, but that's probably better for everyone in some sense. Like, it lifts up the bottom more than other social arrangements. So we're always trying to deal with this inequality phenomenon. And the classical liberal response to it is, we have to make the procedural fairness the sacred value and
Right.
emphasize the importance of freedom.
Yes.
And yes, you can do things to mitigate it. Certain welfare programs are perfectly consistent with classical liberalism, but we're
Myriad.
not going to fuck with the outcome in a coercive manner.
Right. So importantly, you'd have these universalist solutions, right? So
Right.
progressive taxation.
Yes.
What you wouldn't do is say, we're going to tax white people more than Hispanics and then redistribute some of that money to Hispanic families.
Right, which is, by the way, I mean, first of all, affirmative action is the equivalent of that. I mean, it's quite literally a tax on white and Asian success that's redistributed to groups that aren't so successful. And
Correct.
we're all, I mean, so are diversity programs, by the way. I mean, that's essentially taking money from successful groups and giving it to some of the successful group, the educated, and then other groups. And reparations would quite literally be, now we're at the literal, taking a tax and reallocating it.
So just to be clear, you can see the reason that this violates the liberal worldview so clearly. The liberal worldview would say there are going to be these disparities in outcome. We have to deal with those, but we would focus on the individuals, not groups.
Right.
Therefore, you would have means-tested programs, or you would have unions that were inclusive and available to everyone, and they would remedy, like, say, the pay of all General Motors auto workers, etc. So redistributionist policies were based on your actual need, not your race or your gender or your sexuality or your religious beliefs.
Right.
Wokeism then directly subverts that important, like, kind of sacred value of the liberal worldview, because it says we actually are not going to focus on need. We're not going to means test these. It's going to be explicitly based on race or some other demographic measure.
Right. And often it's actually contradicts the sort of needs approach, because when you look at university admissions, when you do things based on class, right, which is what they pretend they're doing in many ways, what happens is you actually just end up with too many poor whites for their taste. So
Right.
what you end up doing is actually rewarding middle to upper middle class Black families, right? And immigrants, by the way.
Mhm.
So yes, you're right. This is obviously a violation of sort of the classical liberal principles here. And by classical liberal, we don't mean libertarian, right? I mean, this is a very, you can go from FDR on the left to like Reagan ideologically on the right or something, all within classical liberalism. So I guess it related to procedural fairness is meritocracy, right? Or the idea that the most talented, skilled people should get the sort of highest status positions in whatever they're doing. And this wokeism, again, challenges this because it cares so much about group outcomes that a woke analysis of a film is how many POCs are in that movie. Why are there only, why is there only one POC in this film? It can't be that maybe the best actors were all white in this for this particular film. That is an intolerable explanation. It must be racism or something else. And so you get these diversity initiatives that are promoted by elite institutions in Hollywood now that say, if you want to get these awards, which are incredibly lucrative and give your film, like guarantee your film historical importance, you have to satisfy these diversity criteria that are not based on merit, right? They're based on what is your ancestry? Do enough of the actors have the right skin color or sexual preferences, right?
Yes. So it's important that for the classical liberal worldview that private institutions are colorblind, right? Reasonably content neutral and engage in procedural fairness.
Well, I would say it's more important that public institutions are.
Yeah. Well, private institutions, we want them to be colorblind, right? Private and public institutions.
Right. Although, so when you get into the public sphere, it gets a little more complicated because you actually do have competing freedom interests, right? Namely, freedom of association.
You mean in the private sphere?
Yeah, I'm sorry. In the private sphere,
but I'm linking this to the meritocracy by saying, like, we expect a corporation that somebody who advances in that corporation, they're advancing because they actually are more productive and more useful to the corporation.
Correct.
That you're not just promoting somebody because he's white or she's white
or black or Asian or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
And
that's
so
kind
what
of
you have in this Great Awokening and the hyper Great Awokening, right? Because people were writing about the awakening in 2017, 18. It was much worse after the death of George Floyd. You had these companies coming out and saying quite explicitly, 25 to 40% of our new hires will be POCs. Correct. You had the Poetry Foundation saying that they were going to hire only Black people to analyze and bring forward, discover or reintegrate this Black poetry into the canon, into the Western canon. And in fact, you can kind of see the Western canon as an interesting source of dispute that illustrates woke sacred values, because this canon, in any discipline, by the way, you have a canon, right? In film, you have a canon. In literature, you have a canon. In music, you have a canon. The Western canon in literature is an organically developing thing, right? It's something that other authors talk about and write about that author, and then over time, you know, Shakespeare or William Wordsworth or Emily Dickinson, they get integrated into this thing. And what happened when the woke criticism took off in the 60s and 70s is woke critics thought that the canon was too white. They're too, and this is something that's like very peculiar to wokeness, right? Which is that this thing's too white. So they were off-put, disgusted by that, and started arguing that the canon was racist and that we needed to have more diversity in the canon. And so, as I think you went through this, I definitely went through this because I love literature and took a lot of literature classes. You would have to read manifestly inferior work simply because of the identity of the author. Now, I should say, like, I understand a culture liking its own, quote unquote, its own like work. So I understand that, like, if you're in a Latin American country, maybe you're going to emphasize Latin American writers or Brazilian writers over French writers or something, right? Okay, yes. But we're in the only way you're going to make the United States work, which, by the way, is an Anglo culture, if you want to put it that way. But the only way you're going to make that work is by emphasizing that all of this is our culture. And if you're a POC, you can't, I don't like this woke idea that, well, that's not my culture. My culture is this unique, different thing. And I want these writers included in the canon. Right? That's kind of a woke narrative that is divisive because it's an attack on the notion that actually we all share this kind of Anglo-liberal culture.
Right. And so from the kind of classical liberal perspective, there were very real failings of liberalism, failures to actually live up to the ideals, like with the Jim Crow South, etc. But the remedy for those failings is actually just instantiating true classical liberal principles.
Correct.
It's more liberalism. Wokeism is looking at that and saying, no, the answer is not classical liberal principles. It's woke principles of multiculturalism, complete equity of outcome, overturning meritocracy, overturning color blindness.
Well, I think a lot of these things are, classical liberalism's fine so long as the outcomes are the ones we want. Right. So it's like, classical liberalism's cool in the NBA because it just happens that for whatever combination of reasons, African Americans appear better right now at basketball than
meritocracy in the NBA, we will not really critique that.
Yeah, that's okay. But when meritocracy leads to outcomes that are too white, meritocracy is assailed and attempt to put something else in its place. And also you're right with I think one of the more, to me, one of the more repellent aspects of wokeism is this multicultural emphasis and a real masochism about Western civilization and Anglo culture, and just the attitude that it's this imperial culture that is repulsive and irredeemably racist, etc. And it's a really consistent attack on it. And people sometimes think I'm exaggerating, but I had to sit through meetings where people would just unload on Western civilization. I mean, it was, if you said, hey, I think Western civilization is pretty cool, you literally had to worry about people complaining about you simply for defending Western civilization. That's how bad it is.
Right. Yes. And so for me, when I think about why does wokeism bother me so much, aside from its capriciousness, canceling people, not allowing free expression and actual free speech, and the vociferous but honest debate of ideas, the scariest thing is repudiating the liberal heritage that, however imperfectly, has held together the world's only true multi-ethnic democracy. Right? Like, That's
Well,
not easy to do. Holding,
couple. I mean, I guess you have
yeah,
like Canada, but they're all Anglo.
right, but yes, but I guess people fail to understand how difficult it is to have a relatively free, prosperous, multi-ethnic democracy.
Right.
Like when human nature uh, it's an unnatural thing, right? Given our evolved human nature.
Right.
And liberalism, like these classical liberal principles, not perfect, but they have done a good job of producing mass affluence and security and the free exchange of ideas within this kind of multi-ethnic democratic system, right?
Right.
And wokeism is
Agreed.
going to, it's in serious danger of breaking that up.
Yes, as I think David Frum, who says, ethnic conflict is the rule, not the exception, right? So you start from, it's really hard to group different ethnicities together into one polity and have it work. Like
to group different ethnicities, those with different religious faiths,
right.
People
And
who speak different languages.
some people, me, would argue that liberalism really does require a certain level of homogeneity at which we are peril of crossing.
Well, it
Uh,
certainly requires some ideological homogeneity, and
right.
that you
It
have to
requires commitment.
internalize the sacred values of
Correct.
liberalism, and make no
Right.
mistake, they are sacred values, right?
Yeah, they
They
are. And
are.
so like I think that people who say like, oh well, every group has sacred values. Yeah, you're right, they do.
Yes.
But some sacred values are better than others. So
Yes.
it's not bad that it's a sacred value. It's bad if it's a stupid sacred value or a deleterious sacred value. Yeah, I agree with you too that the especially like the woke obsession on identity, making everything about identity, policing, like instead of having uh more universal criticisms of police departments and attempts to create police what would you call accountability,
Yeah.
they make it about race, or
Right.
it's just about one issue, and it's a fractious and divisive issue, and that everything's like that with
Right. Like another example where you can just keep race out of it. Say a debate about should we cancel student loan debt or not.
right.
So as soon as this policy is kind of proposed and people are discussing and debating the economic effects of it, how would it redistribute income? Then all of a sudden somebody's going to come with this take that some woke person about what effect does it have on Black people or
Right.
brown people?
And I mean, a good illustration of how extreme this has become is that there was an article in the New York Times, and I think there were two different quote unquote experts. I think one was an ethicist, and I can't remember who the other was. They were talking about who should get the vaccine first, who should count as whatever the term is, but like necessary workers, frontline workers, and essential workers, right? And one of the quotes was, teachers shouldn't count because teachers are predominantly middle class and white, and they haven't been like hit hard. And so like this would be a way to create more equity by disincluding them. And then another one, the more horrifying one that was ridiculed by a lot of people, thankfully, was that older people shouldn't get the vaccine first because older people are more white. And in fact, somebody did an analysis and showed that like what these people were arguing would actually kill more people, including more Black people, but relatively it would save more white people.
Right.
And so they were opposed to it because of that.
Right. So, yeah, and to be clear, from the classical liberal worldview, the way that you would handle vaccine distribution is quite clear, right? You would just look at risk assessment, like universal risk assessment. We want to get the vaccine immediately to people at highest risk of contracting and dying from COVID. you wouldn't focus on race no more than you would focus on what's your favorite football team. We're going to give shots to people who like the Broncos before people who like the Kansas City Chiefs.
Right. And in fact, we should note that classical liberals actually often go out of their way to promote race blindness, even when it would be useful. So, for example, they often argue against various kinds of police profiling or using race in bank loans, for example, even though race actually does provide information. Like if you were a Bayesian and that's all you cared about is making the best decisions possible, you actually would use race.
Right.
But people argue we shouldn't because it's just this, it sort of violates this spirit of color blindness. And a lot of classical liberals don't like that.
Right.
So here comes wokeism giving the bird twice over to color blindness.
Right. And that's the thing that's why I find Kendism to be the most despicable manifestation of wokeism thus far, because it has, it's like, again, it's not push as hard as you can for colorblind institutions, etc. Right. To him, that's actually racist. It's you have to be actively anti-racist, which just means being anti-liberal, really. Like at the end of the day,
I think what it means is we have to have demographic equality somehow.
Which means being anti-liberal.
Well, it does because, right, in our universe, it does, of course, because groups have different skills, talents, traits, cultures, etc. And so you're always going to have these disparities, and it's impossible to imagine getting rid of them. One could imagine a world in which, you know, I don't know, in 5 years, whites were actually doing worse than all POCs. And I think Kendi would be happy. And if you could achieve that via meritocracy, I think the woke wouldn't complain about it. It's just you can't.
Yeah. True enough. So the anti-liberalism is just incidental because of the disparities of outcome.
Right. It's that there's a sacred value and the sacred value. So you can see it's not as if these writers and thinkers are opposed on principle to having blind auditions for a symphony. They're opposed because it doesn't lead to the right outcome, namely more quote unquote diversity, right?
Yeah, exactly correct.
Right.
So let's wrap up by talking about, just for a few minutes, about where we see the future of wokeism moving toward, if we're optimistic or not.
Okay, so I'll go first, I suppose. I'm very pessimistic in that I don't see anything getting better in the next 5 years. You start going out past that, it gets a lot harder, but I would say 10 years. I do think that there's a growing and angry group of what you could call anti-woke people who are dedicated to that as a tribal principle, and in fact who have formed a coalition across many other cutting across political interests in many cases, because they're united behind anti-wokeism. And people laugh and mock that, but in fact, that's how coalitions work, right?
Yes.
You figure out some political foe, and then you form a coalition with people who are opposed to that foe.
Yeah.
So you get more leftist anti-woke people and more right anti-woke people forming a coalition. I mean, some people have called that the IDW. I don't like that. I mean, it just has too many connotations that are unnecessary, and we don't need to go into that. But there definitely is this growing group that's vocal. My fear and my worry is they really don't challenge like a lot of the dogmas effectively, and a lot of it ends up just being complaining about complaining.
Yeah.
Instead of doing the hard groundwork of like studying group differences and what are the causes of these outcomes, it's just a lot of complaining about the other groups complaining. And so I don't know how effective it is right now.
Yes, especially because most of these individuals are not trying to ensconce themselves within important institutions and actually gain power in them, right?
Well,
Like
I would actually argue that a lot of the maladaptive behaviors of this group, a lot of them are caused by their ambition. It's understandable, by the way, that I mean people are ambitious, they want status, so they instead like there are a lot of things that I think people should be doing that aren't necessarily lucrative, right? Doing this sort of hard work on the ground of looking at what are the actual causes of these differences, how much can we understand them, etc. Like what are the best policies to promote.
but also pushing back within the mainstream institutions is important.
Oh,
Right.
yeah,
So
I agree
instead
with
of,
that. So yes,
I won't work at the New York Times. I'm going to take a job with Breitbart, right?
mm-hmm.
Well, you're irrelevant, right? I mean, you can have ideological warfare, but
Right.
You're just ensuring that the New York Times goes further along the woke continuum.
Right, but
And
that's really complicated, right?
it is,
Because it's like, how much can you tolerate at, like, for example, a Barty Weiss or something? I
right.
can understand that your articles get fucked. You see this younger generation working at the place you're at, and they're incredible. I mean, they're hostile to free speech and free journalism in a way that you and I probably don't even understand behind the curtains, you know?
Yeah,
Like that level of hostility. And so, yeah, you're like, well, what am I fucking doing here? And
right.
so, but I mean, you're right. On the one hand, it's like you want people in these institutions to attempt to steer them away from craziness. On the
Yes.
other hand, the people who are in the institutions feel as though they're shackled to these tight constraints and actually incapable of doing what they need to do. So I'm not sure what the best way to do it there is. And by the way, I'm not trying to take people to task. I certainly fall into this camp of criticizing criticism, and like it's fun to do it, and it's probably effective to a degree. But I think the next step has to be, okay, like yes, we need to point out the excesses of the woke left, and we need to criticize that. But what we also need to do is forward a positive agenda, study these differences, look at what are the actual causes of these disparities, forward that message so we can simply analyze things. So, for example, just looking, and this is something Heather McDonald does well, and she's one of the few people out there who's really doing this. Just look at crime disparities and think
Mhm.
about how that should affect our analyses. That's something that we need to do.
Right. So perhaps my advice would be, or suggestion would be, not necessarily that you have to get involved with one of these mainstream institutions that's already been taken over by wokeism, but if you're not going to do that, which is understandable for myriad reasons, as you mentioned, thinking about alternative institutions, right, that actually can impact society rather than just becoming an atomized individual and bloviating on social media all day. Now, again,
Yes.
people need to do that. That's fine.
Right.
There's a niche for that. But at the end of the day, you do need to have some institutional power to instantiate change. Right.
I agree with that. And I mean, one thing that has happened really in the last year that has to be disconcerting for somebody who cares about science, let's say, is the way that even scientific journals have gone woke,
Yes.
especially like Nature. I've noticed it there, but like other journals, and a slew of recent retractions of articles that is clearly motivated by ideology, not science, right? Including retractions of 2 articles where even the authors said they stand behind their results, but basically they're retracting because they've been misused politically or because of potential political misuse.
Right. And
that is very disconcerting.
It's very disconcerting, but that's to me, a clear example where people who are not woke need to gain institutional power.
Yes.
There is you're not going to build a prestigious scientific alternative that can compete with nature or science. That's not happening. So if you just have anybody who's not woke not go into those institutions, they get completely taken over and you have no recourse, right?
Yeah, but the
Scientifically.
question is, what can you do when at this point, for example, I think almost any article that challenges a woke sacred value about group disparities in any way
Mhm.
will not get published. I mean, I don't see, for
Yeah.
example, just to take obviously the most taboo topic, I don't see a paper on race and IQ getting published any time from now that posits that some of the causation is genetic. I just can't imagine that world anymore. It's gone. It is done.
Yeah, I agree with that, but it could get much worse and probably will get much worse.
Right, because one of these papers that was retracted was one on looking at disproportionate use of police force and arguing that when you controlled for the right variables, deadly police force is not disproportionate. And one of the things the author said is Heather McDonald used my article.
Right.
And that was one reason for retracting it. And it's like, yeah, that's a scary world. And this last retraction, I think, was even more disconcerting at human nature, a offshoot of nature, in which they argued that, the way they operationalized it, we can debate it, but they had an operationalization basically of academic success and found that scholars were hurt by having female mentors, right? Now, I don't know if those results hold up. We don't know the causes for it. It's a complicated issue, but clearly the animus against the paper was motivated by political/moral concerns.
Right. So are you advocating just...
I'm almost to the point of advocating all-out war.
So just basically calling it quits on trying to gain power within these mainstream institutions and just saying, fuck it?
I mean, it depends on the mood that I'm in. I sort of go back and forth. I mean, like my emotional predisposition is to work within the institutions, but realistically, I think, I mean, that is probably over. Any realistic strategy there is done.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, it's certainly the case that you're not going to hit a critical mass of power among non-woke individuals that say the New York Times, so you could actually do honest reporting about racial disparities and
right. Or
say crime or something.
Even worse so in academia, it's just becoming, I mean, it's just, it's almost a charade in the importantly, I mean, in the social sciences. A lot of academia is perfectly fine, and people argue with me on this. And yeah, they're right. It's like, yeah, I'm not talking about physics, chemistry, or other disciplines, right? I'm talking about the social sciences, in which you are not allowed to explore certain parsimonious hypotheses because they cut against the preferences of progressives or woke. That's a huge problem, and that's not going away. These journals now have explicitly dedicated themselves.
So perhaps then the better alternative would be to actually build up your own institutions and just make sure that, like, if you build up an alternative science journal, that it's actually dedicated to rigorous peer review and letting all papers go through that meet a certain burden.
Right, whether they support or oppose quote unquote anti-woke interests, right? Because I think we should have journals in which we explore the genetic hypothesis of IQ differences, and you get environmentalists in there too. James Flynn, for example, who just passed away, we should be publishing that. And this, I mean, I guess my personality is different from, like, obviously the average woke person, so I just don't understand this. But, like, I've reviewed woke papers that I strongly disagreed with, and I thought the chances of this being correct is the chances are very low.
Right.
But it's a well done, well argued paper. We should put it out there, and if you have a problem with it, you write an article against it. That's what I want to advocate. And I don't want to make like a PragerU journal that's just like ends up being a conservative or an
Right.
anti-woke journal. Yeah, we have to create institutions with dedicated to liberalism with real integrity and that avoid what's so easy, and you can see it when you try to replace these institutions, just become grifts.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think I agree with you. I'm extremely pessimistic. I understand why people don't want to go through mainstream channels anymore. And instead they're moving to places such as, like, say, Substack, for example, to do journalism.
Right.
I mean, I can't be opposed to that. There are problems with it, but I think if you're an individual journalist like Matt Iglesias and your choices, you can kind of see where this wokeism is going with Vox, or you can go Substack and do your own thing. You're going Substack.
Right.
I completely.
By the way, I think like Matt Iglesias would have some wonderful stories to tell if you could get him in private.
Yeah, I'm sure he does.
The extent of the sort of woke backlash and what has happened to him privately, I bet we don't even know, not even the quarter of it.
Right. So unfortunately, my best prognostication now would be, until you suffer extreme damage to liberalism, you're not going to have a serious pushback against wokeism.
Right.
And that extreme damage, my most likely scenario would be an actual populist who's extremely competent takes over, right? As like wins the presidency, wins, like, say, 2 terms, is extremely popular and pushes through a lot of populist policies that are popular, but do a lot of damage to the idea of the United States as a liberal democratic society.
Well,
and
think,
and then you'll get some, I think, real pushback that's like, hey, maybe we fucked up with this wokeism here.
well, you start to get into the sort of like the era of Sulla. I mean, shout out to Razib Khan. But you get right, you get into the biography on Sulla, the last Republican, right, who marched his troops on Rome. You get into that where you almost need an authoritarian to attempt to defend liberalism, because the challenges against it are so myriad and so powerful that you can't fight them only promoting liberalism anymore. You actually lose that battle. And so you get authoritarian defenses of liberalism. The problem with that is what follows Sulla. Well, then you get the Caesars. Once you break that norm, the next, maybe you get a good person who's like, I'm a fucking authoritarian, but I'm defending liberalism. The next person's not going to do that, right?
And then all of these norms are violated. It no longer seems shocking, right? People become inured to it.
Yeah, so we have so many norms on the left that have been broken for 50, 60 years. And then on the right now, we had a president basically arguing that the election was stolen, refusing to concede, etc., in a way that definitely violated norms. Now, people on the Stacey Abrams still maintains that the election was robbed from her. So it happens on the left too, obviously.
Right.
And it's to the point where these norms have been violated so much that it's basically like, it's the way when you get into a new environment, at first you're like, holy shit, like this is what happens here. Like when you go to like maybe a big college your first month, you're like, what, people party like this? Fucking weird. And then after a month you're just like, well, this is normal. This is how people behave. So every time you violate a norm like that, every time you violate due process, or every James Damore who's fired, just becomes more normal. And you're like, oh, okay, I guess that's how things work.
Yeah, and we can see this with, for example, Trump's allegation of election fraud, because we know from here on out, any conservative candidate who loses his or her, like, whether it's a Senate race or a congressional race, is now going to claim it was fraudulent, Democratic machine, right? That's just going to happen.
I agree, but I do think it's important to point to Stacey Abrams and not to let her off of the hook here. And one of the reasons why I think the Stacey Abrams example is worth noting is because she's largely been applauded by the prestige media, despite the fact that she still maintains that the election was stolen from her without any, I mean, with, you know, these kind of arcane claims about this or that suppression or whatever, but no evidence that the election was actually stolen. This is something that the prestige media does not denounce, whereas when when conservatives do it, they rightfully, I would say, denounce it.
Yes.
There have been a few people, Ben Sass, for example, stepping up lately and denouncing it, and I think everybody should. But I do think, in fairness to irritated conservatives, it should be pointed out that people on the left have done this to praise. Now, no Democratic president has done the equivalent of Trump. I understand that and accept that. So,
right, but the important point is that when you have a woke media with a kind of this homogenous worldview, and they have very clear double standards, right?
Right.
That becomes a real problem, because one of the keys of liberalism, right, is that we have to be critical of violations of these universal principles wherever they're coming from.
Yes.
Whether they're in the service of a good cause or not is irrelevant, right? Whether we supported Stacey Abrams or not shouldn't matter.
I think a good example of this that's just worth mentioning here, because I think we're so inured to it that a lot of people, at least a lot of people on the center left, did not think it was that terrible. It was the Brett Kavanaugh situation. So here you have, I mean, whatever one's opinions about Kavanaugh as a justice, we have a person who's accused by another person of sexual, I mean, impropriety, maybe at lightest, but of maybe sexual assault to attempted rape, some 30 years ago in high school. And the only evidence that's proffered to defend this is one person's story about it.
One person who became a hero.
No, there's literally no corroborating evidence, zero corroborating evidence. And this turns into a...
Well, wait, there were some notes written in his yearbook or something, right?
But they had no...
I know. I'm just saying that that's what was used.
Not only is there no corroborating evidence, the people who could corroborate it, her friends or people, acquaintances at the time, didn't. So there's literally zero evidence in the record that they even knew each other. And we had this hearing, and many people enthusiastically argued that this man should not be allowed to be a Supreme Court justice, despite the fact that he worked incredibly hard, and by all accounts of people who worked with him and knew him as a justice, was a very competent, hardworking person.
Right.
He shouldn't be one because of an accusation that had not even a scintilla of evidence supporting it.
Yes, a 30-year-old accusation.
Right, and this person became a hero for doing
that's
this.
What I mentioned that. Yeah, right.
So, I mean, look,
and also what like the way that psychologists who constantly teach us about the flaws of memory, our propensity to confabulate, the way that they in this case said, well, there are some components of her story that make it more compelling and likely to be accurate. I'm like, dude, no, this is 30 years.
And people would say, it's just like some of the things she said during the testimony. And I think one of her lines was, I mean, this is sort of tangential, but it's like, indelibly etched into my cerebellum or something, she said, or amygdala or something that's like conflating mental processes with neural processes. And I remember reading psychologists saying they were so impressed by that.
Right.
I was like, there's nothing impressive about that whatsoever. It's just like taking neuroscientific language and turning it into a mismatch and putting it together. And yes, it's remarkable that these people who are hyper aware of the fallibility of memory and often talk about how we can't trust eyewitnesses
Right.
even in cases that are like 5 months old, because the mistaken
People who were,
identity.
let's say, very forgiving of Brian Williams, and like, look, like memory is fallible. People tend to exaggerate stories, then they confabulate, and then he probably just came to believe what he was saying.
Which, by the way, this sort of this weird, in my view, disproportionate concern with certain crimes versus other crimes is something that's become common on the woke, mostly left now. So, for example, the very same people who often argue for clemency and forgiveness for violent crimes, even for young people, were encouraging universities to revoke admission to somebody for literally saying a word when she was 15. And that's just weird. I think it would strike any sort of Martian as very bizarre. But when that's your sacred value, you can start to see like what happens to your moral concern and where you put more of it,
So our, I guess, concluding assessment is not very rosy or positive.
Well, right. Maybe we can have another podcast dedicated to what we should do about this,
but
can
potential
do about this. But yes, parting shot is, I see no reason for optimism. In fact, I see this as like there are very gray clouds overhead right now, but there are even more ominous and darker clouds coming.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I really loathe the idea of populism, but deep down inside, I'm like, yeah, maybe that's better than the alternative, or at the least, it's just inevitable that you're going to get somebody on the right who's populist. I just don't see how you avoid that. So I am pretty pessimistic as well.
Yeah.
So maybe, so next time we will talk about potential remedies, and actually maybe we can think about, is populism a legitimate solution to this or not?
And even how can it become a force for good?
Yeah.
Where could it potentially become a force
Is it time for Sulla to fucking march yet or
reign of
not?
Sulla here.
All right.